I'm extremely delighted to have so many people registered for this really exciting webinar today. I'm joined by Brian Comiskey, who's the Senior Director of Innovation and Trends at the Consumer Technology Association. He brings a high caliber of knowledge through his extensive years of experience in the cybersecurity space, which has got a lot of attention recently. More and more we're starting to see cyber attacks happen. We've got data migrating to the cloud. We've got AI models being developed quite rapidly, and that means that there's a very large amount of data that's being prone to being attacked. If you wanted to invest in a leading portfolio of cybersecurity companies, HACK, which is our Betashares Global Cybersecurity ETF, provides a really good access point to this fast-growing sector. But before we jump in, just a couple of disclaimer slides. All information in this webinar should be considered general information only. Brian and myself are not financial advisors, so please make sure that you do seek your own financial advice. We'll also make sure that a recording of this session will be sent to you in the afternoon, and a copy of the slides as well. And throughout the session, there will also be an opportunity to ask questions in the GoToWebinar. So if you look to the right-hand side of your screen, there's a section where you can ask questions. And if we don't have the chance to answer them, we'll make sure to answer them at the end of the webinar. About Betashares, I'm sure many of you are aware, Betashares is Australia's largest or leading ETF provider in the market. We've got the most number of ETFs available for investment on the ASX. But more importantly, we have over 1 million Australians invested with us. So we have a very strong fiduciary duty to ensure that their capital is managed prudently. And part of that is developing really strong relationships with providers like the CTA, which is the largest technology organization in the US. They have a very highly credentialed research team, and they're overall a really good resource for us. So again, really excited and delighted to have Brian on board. He joins us from Consumer Technology Association. He has a decade of experience researching the cyberspace, so he's really the perfect guest to walk us through the ecosystem. So welcome, Brian. Could you just give us a bit more color on yourself, what the CTA is, and what kind of work you do there as well?
Of course. Well, first off, thank you so much, Hugh, for letting me join you all today. And it's a good morning to folks from the lovely evening over here in the States. So I'm Brian Comiskey. I'm the Senior Director of Innovation and Trends at the Consumer Technology Association. As Hugh mentioned, we are the largest North American trade association for the technology space. We represent members from global multinationals like your Amazons, your Googles, all the way down to, a lot of our members are medium and startup-based companies. So really, that whole sector of technology is really represented through us. But if you're not familiar with us in terms of our research, our advocacy work, or our standards work, which I know we'll talk about later today, and how that plays a role in cyber, you probably would know us best as the owners and producers of CES, one of the largest technology trade shows in the world that takes place every year in January in Las Vegas, where it used to be consumer focused, but now 40% of our exhibitors showcase enterprise-based solutions, including cybersecurity. So you have companies like F-Secure, Amazon, IBM, and many others showcasing what the latest advancements in cyber are. And it's a beautiful role to be able to track that from an events perspective, but also as the leader of the team of folks that work on our indexes that help underpin the HACK product, as well as a variety of others across the world. So again, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to talking about cybersecurity today.
Great, thanks very much, Brian. So just in terms of the agenda today, Brian will give us an overview of what's happening in the cybersecurity industry, and then he'll walk us through an example of what companies are doing in response to cyber threats in real time. And then he'll dovetail into what the future state of the industry would look like, particularly in the context of artificial intelligence. We'll then sort of wrap off with the performance and fundamental characteristics of the HACK ETF, but also the underlying constituents themselves, and also save a bit of time for Q&A. So again, extremely delighted to have everyone here, and I really hope that you have a valuable conversation and insight. So without further ado, I'll let Brian provide us with a snapshot of the cybersecurity ecosystem.
Of course. Well, thank you, Hugh. And I think where we should start is what was the baseline? What did the cybersecurity ecosystem look like in the past? And when I first started working on this index about 5-6 years ago, one of the areas was we really just used to bucket companies in sort of 5 areas. The first was antivirus and malware software. That's in a lot of ways kind of your bread and butter cybersecurity. You think like Avast, Norton LifeLock, which are all part of the Gen Digital brand. Really dealing with a lot of those Trojans that you saw. So that was one category. One more of those integrators and managed service providers. And this is oftentimes an overlooked area of the cybersecurity ecosystem. These are like your SAICs, your Booz Allens, your companies that focus very much on customized cybersecurity solutions, usually with a government contract at the end of it. So it's something very custom versus a product that they're selling to market. Specialized middleware, really try to bridge the gaps of software and hardware. Then you had your specialized software and services. This is really where Cloudflare and CrowdStrike, some of these companies really started to push the envelope in terms of all the solutions that would come to a head, and we'll get to that in a moment with the latest update on the ecosystem. But specialized software and services has really merged into being kind of the table stakes in a lot of ways for the ecosystem. But then the last bucket really was these hardware solutions, because we tend to think of oftentimes that cybersecurity is just occurring in the cyberspace, but as we'll talk about with things like endpoint in a moment, your device is just as important. So that's really what it used to be. So let's take a look at on the next slide really of what is the ecosystem now. And as you can tell, there's a lot of words on this page. There's a lot of different sort of terminology, and really whenever you have innovation in cybersecurity, you're going to drive a growth and diversity in products and services. In many ways, cybersecurity is the embodiment of disruption economics 101. Christopher Friedman used to say, in times of conflict or downturn, innovation bunches up and accelerates. And what better way than in the light of a hack or any sort of cyber attack are you going to see innovation in this space? We're seeing more attacks than ever, and we're seeing more innovation in the threat space. So as a result, you see all these different solutions on the screen that are innovating in response to that, right? Conflict invites resolution, as it were. So when I think of and look at this, I really want to dive into 3 in particular really quickly. The first is you see security, orchestration, automation, and response. Much better just to say SOAR. It's a great acronym for a reason. This is a stack of compatible software programs that enables an organization to collect data about a cybersecurity threat and then respond to it with little or no human assistance. This is where you're really starting to see where AI and machine learning took kind of their, and we'll dive into it a little bit more later, but really where they emerged from. And when you think about this space, think about products like Fortinet has FortiSOAR, Palo Alto has the Cortex XSOAR, and Rapid7 has Insight Connect. That's the first. The other 2 are endpoint security. And by that, I'm talking about a cybersecurity approach that defends endpoints, such as desktops, laptops, which a lot of us are using literally right now, and even mobile devices from malicious activity. How do you shore up every single entry and access point to your network? So this is where Avast has had an endpoint protection service from Gen Digital. CrowdStrike's Falcon is very famous in this space as a major product for it. And the last, and this has to do a lot with what we're doing right now with a virtual webinar, and this is why I wanted to highlight it, is identity and access management, which really is referring to IT security discipline framework solutions that are about managing your digital identities. We're in a more virtualized hybrid world where we're doing virtual webinars, virtual learning, virtual work. And so you want to make sure that you're provisioning and deprovisioning identities to securely authenticate who is actually using these materials or resources or certain actions. CyberArk out of Israel is a software as a service company that really has provided this sort of space, and it's end-to-end security, visibility, and analytics. Zero trust, if you're familiar with that phrase, is a part of this sort of framework where you're trying to make sure that the person using that software or solution is the person you actually think it is.
Great, thanks very much, Brian. Obviously, there's a lot of different solutions and products that these cybersecurity companies are developing, and it just confirms and gives us evidence that the number of cyber attacks is happening more frequently, and the dollar, loss to enterprises and governments is becoming larger and larger. So, I guess coming to our next question. In terms of regulation, a lot of governments are setting up different cybersecurity bodies. Could you just give us a snapshot as well? What's happening regulation-wise?
Yeah, of course. And I think when you're looking at what the regulatory space really looks like right now, there's a lot focused on how are you reporting incidents, right? There's a recognition that an incident's going to happen. If you look in the last few years, the United States had an attack that hit, I think, 13 different cabinets. That was the SolarWinds hack, if you recall, and it hit Justice Department and others. So what has emerged in response in particular, that's really kind of the North Star principle, at least I'm based in the United States, and we're watching it very closely in this regard. And I used to work in cyber policy for the US Coast Guard. North Star really has become this Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act of 2022. So this requires covered entities, and by covered entities, I refer to 16 critical infrastructures that the Biden admin has identified. That is communications, utility companies, exactly what you would think as critical to the operation of an economy or business or consumer day-to-day life. So what it does is the federal government now requires covered entities to report cyber incidents within 72 hours of reasonably believing an incident has occurred. And that's important, right? Because it is very possible while trying to get an understanding of an incident, you might not fully know if you're hacked or not. Hopefully you have a tool like some of the ones that we'll talk about today that lets you know quickly. But covered entities also must report things like ransomware payments within 24 hours. And that rule really is intended to prevent, deter, and respond to significant cyber incidents. That's the baseline. So that's where the enterprises, critical government infrastructure tools, they're all looking at that. What's emerging in conjunction or in parallel with it is this new idea, and this is not something just in the United States. There's efforts in Germany already and Singapore to do this, but cyber labeling or cyber marks. So there's a new initiative that is just been approved. When it rolls out is still trying to be determined and worked through, but it's called the US Cyber Trust Mark Program. And this is broad support for IoT security. And it really helps kind of understand the impacts of distributed denial of service attacks. But think of it almost as if you're looking at a box of food and you see the nutrition labeling. The idea is it's a voluntary program where companies will tell you what the risks are to your cyber profile. And it's a novel way, right, of increasing what you would call cyber hygiene, which is how well, like there's a reason I use wired headphones. They're not hackable as Bluetooth. This is things that you pick up, but you want to help consumers get to a point that they understand that better. I'm talking about this a lot because I'm proud to say that this is something that the Consumer Technology Association was part of day one in creating the regulation, including one of the lead analysts that works on our cybersecurity index. He's been in the space for 3 decades, and he's one of the instrumental people who got this program really on the ground. And Germany and Singapore have already started implementing these programs, and we expect the UK and a few other countries to follow suit and really start working together because let's be honest, you're not siloed by one nation. These are oftentimes multinational, cross-border sort of incidents oftentimes.
Great, thanks. Yeah, interesting. I mean, even Australia, like taking it back home, we've got a cybersecurity strategy as well, which has been planned out for the next sort of 7 years from 2023 to 2030. We're about a year in, and it's divided into 3 different horizons. We call it by firstly building out the existing cyber infrastructure that we have, increasing the accessibility of cyber solutions to SMEs and small businesses and individuals. Gradually over time, the government is expecting that we develop emerging new technologies as the complexity of AI and cyber threats increase. So it's, to your point, Brian, definitely countries around the globe are, cybersecurity is front and center for these nations.
Yeah, and I'm glad I just to raise that point,
Oh,
right, where it's small businesses, right? Oftentimes they can't afford those SMEs, they can't afford those experts. So what you said about those emerging technologies like AI, that's what will bridge the gap. And that's why governments are so keen on AI investment. Cybersecurity is part of that story.
great. Thanks very much. Brian, could you just give us an example as well of a recent hacking scandal, just to kind of tie everything that we've talked about together in real life?
Yeah, and so I'm actually really excited because I get the chance to talk about a company I don't often do that I think is quite innovative, out of Japan actually, Trend Micro. But let's kind of go to the basic questions of like answering around the cybersecurity of the what, the who, the when, and the how. So what was kind of this incident? Global law enforcement just recently revealed that they had disrupted this ransomware group called Lockbit, and it really helped kind of kill the viability of a long-term malware plan that this group had. Lockbit was responsible for about 25% of all ransomware leaks in 2023, causing billions of dollars in losses for thousands of global victims for the past years. And so in February 2024, it was announced that they had essentially busted and this group doxed the leader of it, who was a Russian national. And underpinning all of this was Trend Micro. So who's Trend Micro before we even get to how they did it? Trend Micro provides antivirus and other security products that protect flow of information on PCs, file servers, email servers. They've averaged, actually, to be frank, through their products about 75% annual growth over the past decade because of this. And their customers include not just governmental agencies in the United States and Japan, as well as the UK, but also British Airways, Merrill Lynch, and Microsoft Pac Bell. But how did they do this? So Trend Micro actually infiltrated the Lockbit group. This is where it's not just about the products and services that these companies have on board, but also the experts of being able to blend in with these communities. Ransomware as a service is a lucrative illicit business. It's something in the US Coast Guard we tracked all the time. And so when you look at it, so they infiltrated, they were able to prevent the group from releasing their next suite of malware products, and also protected all of their own customers from these threats even before the group, Lockbit, had finished testing their tools. Further, they collaborated and provided threat intelligence with the FBI and the National Cybersecurity National Crime Authority to directly assist their investigation and successfully disrupt this group. So this is really an action where it's about not just, these companies are not just providing innovative products and solutions, they're providing that hands-on expertise and really going across government and the private sector, which really I think reinforces this evolution of the ecosystem and the landscape itself. We've talked about all the technologies, but companies are now expected to even be more hands-on, because there's a recognition that, in a way, cybersecurity is almost like having water or electricity, right, that run your building. It's an expectation that you need to have cybersecurity tools, cloud tools, even now probably AI. All of these things are almost like digital utilities that underpin day-to-day enterprise and consumer living. So companies need to be able to prepare to protect from that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, to your point that Trend Micro is an example of a company that's becoming very hands-on, I think in order to be competitive, particularly in cybersecurity, where there is becoming a lot of saturation, there's a lot of M&A activity happening, different companies bolting on different services to their suite of offerings. It's become very important that you continue to develop those new technologies. Otherwise, those threats, you wouldn't be able to address them. But yeah, sorry, Brian.
I was going to say, if I could quickly add too, right? This is a recent example, but governments really rely on these private partners to be able to help build out these proactive plans. The longer example I'll give you is, if you remember the NotPetya attack, which was coming out of Russia, hit Merck, the pharmaceutical company, Maersk, the global shipping company. Yep. That threat was 2017 when that happened, and it hit pretty substantially a lot of companies. It took a while to solve and fix it. Policy was still being developed in 2019 when I was at the US Coast Guard. around that 2017 attack. So that's 2 years after the fact, and we know that attacks occur so quickly. So that's where those private partners help fill these gaps, and that's when you look at like kind of the innovation of some of these publicly traded companies that really help ensure that we're thinking about what's on the horizon and not just trying to pick up the pieces of a previous attack.
Yeah, great. And Brian, I just wanted to ask, how does ransomware fit in innovation? Does it fit within the old or the new ecosystem? There's been a lot of focus on ransomware recently. Just last night there was a ransomware attack on London hospitals. So yeah, just give us a snapshot of the attention that's been on ransomware.
Yeah, you would think, like when I first started talking about this index product in itself, I was talking about ransomware as a major threat area, and you would think, as much as there's a lot of innovation in different types of threats and attacks, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would have accepted I might not be talking about ransomware as much today. In fact, in 2022, the growth had stagnated in terms of ransomware attacks. But then 2023 happened, and you've seen a rapid acceleration of ransomware attacks, to be honest, cyber attacks in general. In the past year, there's been nearly 4,000 new cyber attacks occurring every day. Every 14 seconds, a company falls victim to a ransomware attack, which can result in devastating kind of financial losses, while you have 560,000 new pieces of malware detected every day, right? But for every 14 seconds is a pretty significant amount of ransomware attacks. So it remains usually one of the top 3 threats. Why it's increased really is artificial intelligence, to be frank, because you're able to scale these attacks at a much more rapid pace than before. That 14-second number, in the past, it was about 37 seconds. And I want to say that was in the 2018, 2019 time frame, right? So you've almost halved that in about 5 years. What happens as large language models help make ransomware attacks look more sophisticated than ever? You go from kind of standard ransomware being done through sort of a phishing based attack to you can really use AI to spear phish, right? Make it more targeted, more catered to the intended victim, if you will. And as a result, the cost is going up for these attacks. The average ransomware payout now is $5.23 million US. If you can't tell by my accent, I usually am saying US dollars. But it's important to remember that those costs aren't just felt in the first year alone, or a single year. Only 66% of your costs on a ransomware attack occur in the first year. Second year is 22%. The last 11% is your third year. So think about that window too, where you're picking up the pieces financially for a 3-year cycle after any sort of attack.
Yeah, it's a bit worrying, like, to see AI presenting so many businesses' data getting lost, and also a lot of legal fines being paid out. The scale and complexity, as we talked about, of these attacks is increasing. I think a lot of people, generally have a belief that AI is a headwind for a lot of businesses, but I actually think that there's a lot of opportunities, particularly on some of those new ecosystem offerings that you talked to, Brian, such as SOAR. There are also other cybersecurity companies like CrowdStrike and Darktrace, which are becoming AI native platforms for cybersecurity. So could you probably walk us through some examples of innovations that companies are using AI for in the cyberspace?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned those 2 examples, and I'll start with CrowdStrike, mostly because when I think about innovative AI tools, I do think right away to their Charlotte AI program. And this is a generative AI-based assistant that is designed to help automatically detect or scan for security threats. And what's so novel about it really is it's plain language prompting. When you think about kind of all the issues that's occurring in generative AI right now, which is actually what I usually talk about more these days, you have hallucinations, right? You have to focus so much on prompt engineering to get the correct information. Charlotte AI is really focused on plain English because, let's be honest, I might have been in the space for 10 years, but I'm not an engineer. So that I might not know the technical term or the exact file that I want to find. So I need an assistant that can bridge that gap. And that's important too, because we think about that, and I mentioned this earlier, where not every company can afford a subject matter expert. I work for a not-for-profit trade association. We don't have that sort of budget. So tools like Charlotte AI, which have this sort of plain language intuitive model, can really help kind of bridge that gap. And just because they developed that doesn't mean they've stopped there. They just launched an AI native cybersecurity solution for small and medium businesses on Amazon Business called Falcon Go, and it does endpoint protection and ransomware prevention. So that ransomware focus is important. So that's CrowdStrike, but let's talk a little bit more about Darktrace, where they focus on a lot of these cloud native security solutions with a self-learning AI that really focuses on visibility of cloud architecture. When you think about a lot of the misconfigurations in the cloud, right now there's about 93% of cloud instances have a misconfiguration that is a human error. That's exploitable. That is something where any sort of attack group or ransomware group is going to look exactly for this area and angle to exploit. And so Darktrace is really starting to lean into there for threat detection and real-time response, because that's the big one. Globally, if you think just about data in general, the human population produces about 2.5 quintillion bytes of data a day. That's 2.5 followed by like 18 zeros. That's already too much data for humans to process. So what fills that gap? You have to have artificial intelligence. Now think about that in the context of, cybersecurity, and you start to get into this idea of, well, how many attacks that are occurring in the cloud? And in fact, at the end of 2022, and I'm waiting for a 2024 figure, Zscaler found in one quarter 20.1 billion threats hidden inside the cloud. That is impossible for a human analyst. So someone like Darktrace or CrowdStrike, or even now Cloudflare, which is starting to employ AI large language models, that's vital to being able to detect and respond and assist humans, whether they have experts on staff or not.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I think the technology behind Darktrace is incredible. They're using what we call unsupervised AI models. So what they essentially do is they'll get an understanding of the operations or day-to-day business activities of what a company does. And if there's anything out of whack, then that would pick up as a flag to investigate a bit further. But absolutely right, Brian. The scale of data that we're seeing every day is only increasing. There's a lot of capex, which is capital expenditure on data centers built out by companies like Amazon, Google, Facebook, etc. Data is the new oil in this economy, and you need to protect it to ensure that your business can operate day to day. So given that there's so much spending happening, Brian, could you give us any numbers of what spending looks like in the industry and what we can expect it to look like going forward?
Yeah, of course. And I think what we'll be able to actually show maybe even a slide that shows some of that. But to really kind of tee us up, right? Thinking about the context too of where are we, right? And this kind of goes back to the scale, right? 57% of companies experienced significant security incidents in the last year, 79-minute average breakout time to begin moving across corporate systems. The other context too is it was about $8 trillion, the cost of global cybercrime last year. That's a significant amount of money. So what you're seeing is about 215 billion forecasted global spend for security and risk management in 2024 for Gartner. That's a 14% increase. You're also seeing budgets starting to come through for the US government, for example. And so in part of the $1.2 trillion fiscal spending package from the US government, there's going to be about $2.8 billion that's going to be allocated to the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, CISA. What's interesting about that bill is actually that's private industry is spending more and more. The CISA one might be slightly less in the past, which is fascinating because it's almost a recognition that private sectors are really going to be, and these companies that are leading the innovation are going to be the ones who offer the tools that help prevent businesses and everyday solutions to be able to mitigate these sort of attacks. So when you think about that, you're basically looking at velocities increasing, scales increasing of attacks. So as a result, spend has to follow in this case. And it really gets into, again, going back to it, is the table stakes of a modern enterprise. Cybersecurity is probably one of the most established in this space and will always continue to grow as threats innovate in terms of being this sort of digital utility. And with the cloud really having become more mature than ever in a lot of ways as a result of the pandemic, think of the pandemic like a stress test for the cloud, right? Like we really put it through its paces. We know that that's a table stakes for enterprise and consumer living. Now, what you'll see is AI has to be added into that gap. And so wherever there's maybe sort of a spend gap or a shortage gap, that's where it'll pick up the pace. But that $215 billion forecast is really something to hold to, and that's global. And that is large scale businesses, if I remember correctly. So there's more spend going that way. And again, it's a recognition that if crime is going to cost so much, if attacks are going to cost more, you're probably going to make sure that you want this. And in conjunction, cybersecurity premiums are going to increase as well. And you'll see that companies are going to start putting in more money to ensure that they're avoiding any sort of data extortion demands. Cybersecurity insurance is becoming quickly globally one of the top, most expensive premiums for good reason. So you have to make sure you're allocating that money. And that's not sometimes just on solutions. Companies are prepared to spend more, again, for that staff and expertise. So really starting to see better chief information security officers or security and tech officers to really make up that gap.
Agreed. Like, just to support this slide, Brian, there's a quarterly survey done by Morgan Stanley. So they actually interview executives of major enterprises and businesses, and they noted that cybersecurity was one of those areas that were least likely to cut their spending budgets. Or another way to phrase it, they're more likely to keep spending to ensure that they have enough cyber solutions just in case a threat does occur. So to your point, definitely agree that spending in cyber is here to stay. But if we I think, moving forward, 3, 5, 10 years, Brian, what does the future state look like? What are some of the key areas of innovation that you feel the cybersecurity industry will sort of move towards?
And certainly the backbone to all of this that we're talking today is AI is really like something. Part of my role at CTA is I serve as our resident futurist, and I have to think about what technology landscape, not just cybersecurity, looks like in the next decade. If you ask me right now, this decade is a race between kind of what you're seeing in the GLP-1 space, but then AI is probably going to be AI's decade. And as a result, that pushes forward what's innovation going to look like in the cybersecurity space as a result. And the first is the focus on an attention to infrastructure threats. So I had mentioned it at the top where you have new reporting standards now that are really speaking to the United States requiring 16 critical infrastructure to report. And that's because you're seeing more attacks, especially come from state actors. A really good stat from Verizon to remember is 71% of cyber attacks are usually financially motivated. That leaves a 29% gap, but where you go, well, what are the other ones? 4% is kind of like a bucket of like hacktivism, other types of hacks, people experimenting. 25% is state actor. And that's only increased in the context of global conflict in the last years, where you're seeing a Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? Where they went for critical infrastructure first. And so where is that likely going to occur? You're going to see edge devices and consumer grade networking hardware face increased attacks. So when I was talking about those 5 buckets on the baseline, there's a reason I mentioned hardware, because that is the forgotten one in a lot of ways. And you think about what's going on in this AI revolution, we're in a place where hardware is probably advancing a little bit faster than the software itself right now. So how do you secure that? And so that's going to be, in 3 to 5 years, that's the first major area. AI will have a critical role in really what you'll see is an increase in social engineering escalation. So, right, let's start with it. AI-powered deepfakes. It's going to extend beyond media, government, political actions. It's going to start getting into maybe even social media at the personal level, because you can really start to engineer. I'll give a couple examples. I'm going to give you a good example, actually, of kind of deepfake technology, which comes from generative adversarial networks, or GANs. But you had one example where it did work. If you were following the South Korean election in the last few years, not the upcoming one, but the recent one, the current president used a deepfake version of himself to cut advertisements. Ironically, that version was more popular with youth voters. And so they actually kept doing it because he didn't have time to make ads, and they're able to focus. That's a good one. That there's always an upside to these technologies. Technology is really, it's how people use it rather than what it is itself. The negative side, though, is you start to get business attacks through social engineering. If there was a financial services company in China where an employee went online seemingly talking to his C-suite executive boss with 40 other participants on the call with them. None of them were real. They were all deep fake engineers, and he approved about a $2 million spend or something to that effect because he thought they were real. That's how good these engineering attacks are going to be. So you're really going to start to see more fraudulent wire transfers and executive impersonation over the next few years. And that's an example of just the last year. I can't imagine what it looks like in 3 to 5 years in some ways, where the speed of that. The final one, we're talking about AI really owning this decade a lot of the time, but we would be remiss if we didn't think about it's 2024, rapidly approaching 2025. We're almost halfway through this decade. What does the next decade look like? And the 2030s is the quantum leap. And I'm not talking about the great sci-fi TV series from back in the day. I'm talking about quantum computing. And so when we think about quantum computing, you also have to think about PQC, which is post-quantum cryptography. And this is really, how do you build quantum safe cryptography as quantum computing becomes more of a reality? There are commercial quantum computers that exist. IBM actually debuted their commercial quantum computer at CES in 2019. That was 5 years ago. Enterprises already are starting to look at how can we adapt to have quantum safe standards to prevent hacking, because the speed at which a quantum-based computer can use AI to accelerate attack is going to only grow. And so in this year, you're seeing from the NIST, that's the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the United States, they have completed their post-quantum cryptography standards. And you're going to see 10% of enterprises will probably publish their own security plans this year. A lot of that is in response to, about 2 years ago, NIST did a competition for companies to create, any organization to create a PQC standard, expecting that it would take a few years for anyone to be successful. 2 companies were successful in about a year. So you're already seeing that just because quantum computers are not out in the wild all the time, you can simulate quantum environments through Azure Quantum or Azure Bracket and AWS Quantum. So these environments already exist on the cloud from major hyperscalers. AI allows you to simulate quantum computing. So as it starts to really merge into the overall ecosystem, we have to be prepared for it, because we expect, again, threats are always going to innovate. This is going back to the beginning. There's always going to be a new threat. There's always the risk of an attack. There's 4,000 new ones every day. So there's an understanding that you might get hit, but you have to prepare as much as you can. And this one feels like we know this is coming. That's where we really have to start preparing now. And so starting with standard development is key, and then it's planning, and then it's investment. And so that's what I'm really looking forward to. If infrastructure threats is next 1 to 2 years, social engineering is 3 to 5, quantum is that 5 to 10. And so that's why we lay it out like this. We like to kind of work left to right. It's very intentional, the slide.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot to look forward to, over the next few years and decade. I definitely think that cyber as a thematic is here to stay, just given, the wealth of information that you've provided us. So I do really appreciate, walking us through the ecosystem and walking through some company examples and giving us some developments of what the cyber industry is looking like in the context of AI. So I just wanted to bring this back to a portfolio sense and investment sense, how investors can actually add global cybersecurity to their investment portfolios. So, I'm sure many of you are aware, HACK is the Betashares Global Cybersecurity ETF. It is around a $900 million fund. It has about 30 stocks within the portfolio and has been around for about just under 8 years now. Some of the top names within the portfolio or the ETF include companies that we talked to, Broadcom, CrowdStrike, Palo Alto, and Darktrace, for example. So you're really getting a diversified pure play exposure to cybersecurity companies. In terms of valuations and what type of multiple we're looking at for the HACK ETF, you'd be surprised how it's not too inexpensive. What we've seen actually from a research published by the NASDAQ is that the price to earnings ratio, which is essentially the share price of the fund divided by the earnings per share, that was actually at around 40 times just a few years ago. And we're expecting that to come down to around 22 to 23 times by the end of the year. But there's a key reason why. It's really supported by strong fundamentals. Fundamentals are what we refer to as earnings, right? If a company can grow earnings, that denominator part will increase, which would push down the price to earnings ratio. I'm sure many of you on this webinar have allocations to Australian equities or a broad-based MSCI World, for example. They're still forecasted to grow earnings per share at around 4, 9%, even 13% for the S&P 500. But with HACK, the earnings per share 1 year out is expected to grow around 18%. So there's a really strong tailwind in terms of earnings forecasting growth over the year. Just moving on to the next slide here, sorry. Just on performance and what performance has looked like. It's delivered very strong performance since it was incepted in 2016. It's actually beaten the MSCI World denominated in Australian dollars and also the S&P 500 benchmark. We're looking at returns of around 17% per annum since the fund was incepted. Even if we look at that gray line at the top, that's actually the NASDAQ 100 index. You might be thinking, well, why has it performed better than HACK? What are some of the advantages that HACK can add to my existing portfolio? An interesting thing to note is, cybersecurity as a theme is a fairly defensive sector. As Brian and myself talked to, spending is here to stay, and executives of companies are unwilling to cut down their budgets just to save on costs, because if you're cutting back on your cybersecurity budget, then you're probably going to leave yourself a bit more prone to attacks from adversaries, whether that be state enterprises or individuals with AI capabilities. So just in comparison to the NASDAQ, we're looking at lower max drawdowns. What that means is that if you had a market sell-off, the HACK ETF hasn't fallen by as much as the NASDAQ, such as COVID. And there's also lower variability compared to the NASDAQ 100 index. So you're getting, a lower variability in returns generally over time. Another thing I wanted to point out is that this is really a truly differentiated portfolio. There's really only 6 common holdings or stocks between HACK's, constituents and also the NASDAQ. So, what HACK gives you really is a pure play exposure to the cybersecurity thematic. Just wanted to wrap off. Obviously, there's a few things to consider here. There's always going to be investment risk that the value of your fund or holding in the ETF can change over time, depending on where we are in markets or what's happening to a specific company. You need to consider whether the fund is suitable for you in terms of your risk profile. We suggest that you have at least the medium to long-term time horizon for a thematic fund like HACK. Again, any information that we've presented in this webinar is just general information only, and this should not be taken as financial advice. We might wrap that up and move on to the questions segment of this webinar for about 5 to 10 minutes. So I'll just go through what we have. We've got a few questions on distributions. In the past, HACK used to pay dividends. Why did that cease? So that is true. HACK did pay strong dividends in 2021 and 2022. But just to take a step back, fund distributions are really driven by two primary things. The first being the distribution yield of the underlying companies, and second, any capital gains if the fund sold positions at a profit. Historically, we've seen cyber companies reinvest any earnings back into their businesses for future growth prospects rather than paying them out as dividends. But what we saw during that 2021-2022 period was that companies within the fund actually performed strongly, and many were actually acquired due to M&A activity. So selling at a profit isn't a bad thing, but that has to be paid out as distributions. Just in terms of why there hasn't been a distribution in the last 2 half-yearly periods, the fund actually made a capital loss during the financial year 2023, and that was one reason why the fund didn't pay a distribution. But if we expected M&A activity to pick up and the fund continues to perform well, then you could theoretically expect distributions to be made in the future. But again, we can't guarantee what that might look like, as with any investment. We have a question on what would be your estimates for HACK returns for the future 12-month, 3-year, and 5-year periods. We touched on performance and fundamentals before. We saw that HACK's performance was really driven by strong earnings growth. Over the long run, you'd expect share price returns to follow earnings growth. So if you took a view that the underlying companies within HACK, like Broadcom, Palo Alto, Darktrace, for example, if you expect their earnings to increase over the medium long term, then theoretically you should also expect strong returns over the next 12-month, 3-5-year periods. Again, we can't guarantee what that might look like, but generally share price returns tend to follow earnings as well. Brian, I think this one might be for you. We had a question on whether are companies broadening out their cyber solutions as competition increases within this space. I think you touched on the new ecosystem and that laundry list of different cyber offerings. So I'm guessing part of that question is yes, but maybe if you could elaborate on why that's occurring again.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And yes, the simple, easy answer would be yes, it is expanding. But let's give a little bit of an example. And one I really like is actually Palo Alto Networks, really focusing on their angle. They're doing what's kind of a platform-based focus where there's an ability for, if you go into their product, it's a platform that allows you to look at different solutions that can answer and address any sort of problem under the sun, really, of what cybersecurity would look like. And this is a strategy shift for Palo Alto, really trying to say, look, we recognize that any sort of issue might actually be much more individualized than a global one-size-fits-all solution. So here we'll give you this ability and this tool set to approach it. CrowdStrike and Cloudflare, they're similar things. CrowdStrike really pivoted deeper into AI with Charlotte, as well as some of the Falcon Go options, versus in the past, right? Like Darktrace and SentinelOne, I like to think are AI companies first that targeted cybersecurity, versus CrowdStrike is a cybersecurity company that has managed to bring AI into their ecosystem. So there's always this impetus to grow and add more services. But as innovative an idea as a platform is, one company likely will never have all that expertise. New threats come all the time, which is why that you see companies that have not IPO'd yet, that on our side, for when we look at our universe, we watch publicly traded companies, but we also try to pay attention of who might be next to IPO to get into that ecosystem. Your companies like your Wiz, your Cato Networks, your Arctic Wolves, who are doing a little bit different sort of solutions that would require, maybe even if you're a Palo Alto doing a platform, that you might want to partner with this company. I wouldn't be surprised where you start to see this is happening overall in general in the tech space, more partnerships occurring even to really say like, look, I have an expertise in this solution, you have this one, let's work together and jointly bring it in. Or you might see swapping of parts of a company too. Thoma Bravo has been very active in the acquisition space. They just sold off part of their, I think it was the Sophos acquisition. They sold off those materials to CyberArk to really bolster CyberArk's identity and access management tool. So you're going to start to see maybe a play of maybe swapping of different assets as people want to specialize, but there's always going to be the impetus of, well, if we're in this field, it's interrelated to that one. So we might as well build a solution in that. Because really, at the end of the day, and this is not just a cybersecurity insight, innovation doesn't occur in silos. It's not in a vacuum. Any sort of breakthrough, whether that's a threat or a new solution, has downstream impacts on the rest of the ecosystem and other technology areas. So yes.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, to your point that technology companies are partnering, and it's not just within cybersecurity. Like, there's a lot of parallels with AI pure plays or hyperscalers. You know, the Mag 7 companies, your large cap tech, also chip manufacturers as well. You know, there's sort of moving into different parts of the supply chain. You know, such as chip design and manufacturing, like Intel is trying to do. But you know, I won't go too much into that. This is a cybersecurity webinar. But it's an interesting point that you make, Brian. It is not just the cyber industry that we're seeing M&A activity and partnerships happening. It's also in other technical fields, as you know, such as AI as well. We have a lot of questions, but we might wrap it up there. Just noting time. We really appreciate everyone's time here today, and hope you enjoyed the session. You know, we do publish regular content on our website. So if you type in betashares.com.au, you should be able to find, you know, information about our funds, insight pieces as well. We have our chief economist, David Basneets, who writes weekly insights of what's happening in markets and the economy. There'll also be, you know, a recap of this session as well that will be posted online. You can also follow us on our social media channels as well, which we have here. So Brian, thank you very much for your time. I had a really enjoyable conversation, and I hope that many of you online did as well, and you got a lot of good takeaways from this webinar.
Thank you so much, Hugh. And thank you for letting me join this evening / this morning.
Great, thanks, Brian.
Cheers.